Isaiah, you've been doing this for a while. I mean, we did a whole spring football, and honestly, for what my money's worth, kind of, I want to say more one of the more business as usual springs. Not a lot of, I mean, we know what the expectations of this team are. We know who's coming back. We know the guys who are out injured. Um, I think the biggest takeaway from the spring was the continuity, the expectations, the honing in on those details. But as we exit the spring, as they did, a little over a month ago, now we transition into these summer months. I'll start with this for you. I mean, what do you see right now as the biggest storyline with this team, between now and the time we get to this fall camp?
Well, in a way, you kind of hit on it. It's just the fact that there aren't any big storylines, right? We're not in this situation where you're looking and saying, okay, you've got a quarterback battle. Who's going to be the starting X receiver? Who's going to be the starting running back? How are they going to fill in all these vacancies for the offensive line or what have you? We pretty much know what this team is, even with all of the positions that were vacated. It's kind of weird that Michigan had 9 NFL draft picks last month, and yet it doesn't really feel like they lost anything, right? Like that's really bizarre. I mean, 4 of those guys won the first 3 rounds, and yet it doesn't really feel like there's a situation where you always see this kind of with the rival message boards, right? Where it's like, how on earth is Michigan going to replace that person, right? They were always terrible until they leave, and then Michigan, there's no way they can replace them. It's one of those things where I just feel like you have, like you said, the continuity. It's a situation where they just have pretty much all of the ducks in the row. And that is pretty rare for this Michigan team. Usually, I mean, last year we're talking about a quarterback battle. We're talking about how you're going to replace Hassan Haskins, who's going to step up on the defensive line with Aiden Hutchinson and David Ajabo gone. There was a lot of stuff like that. We're not talking about that this year. So I think now it's kind of a lack of that, which means how do you move forward? How do you press on? How do you get better? But certainly, and I've brought this up on my show quite a bit, there's a little bit of leeriness, I think, at least for me, as someone who was a Michigan student in 2007, going from 2006 to 2007, because that was the last time that Michigan had this level of expectations, right? Where it's you have to make it to the national championship game, otherwise it's a failure. What did they do straight out of the gates in 2007? The worst imaginable thing. So I certainly have that in the back of my mind a little bit. So it's a matter of how do you press on? How do you press forward? How do you get better? The good news is the non-conference schedule theoretically sets up really well. And as long as they keep their focus, they're in just such a good spot entering summer.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we've talked about it a few times here, just in terms of when you watch this last NFL draft, the biggest storyline wasn't that, okay, great, Mozzie Smith went in the first round. You keep that, you keep that pedigree alive. You send some of these impact guys to the draft. But the biggest storyline, and NFL guys were talking about it dating back to the combine, was that it's about who isn't in this draft, or when they would turn on the tape of these other guys, turn on the tape of the Ohio State guys, and you're seeing Michigan guys make plays on film and realize, look, these guys are coming back next year. So it's the continuity. It's always fascinating to me. I think it's when you have that level of guys coming back, and you have this level of coaching staff is mostly intact. All of your key pieces are mostly intact. Listen, I mean, last year was a great season. So for them to come out and just kind of feel like they could skate through it, I think there's a human element where in the back of your mind, like you said, you're always kind of worried that, the other shoe might drop, especially as a Michigan fan, because even when times are good, it always feels like there might be chaos or disaster lurking around the corner. But I think that, the biggest task that this program and this coaching staff has right now is finding ways to keep yourself hungry, to keep yourself motivated. And I think given the fact that, it used to be bowl games were take them or leave them. Now, the last 2 years, you've been in the college football playoff, and you've played 2 of your worst games of the last 2 years on the biggest stage. And I think that, something that Michigan has done so well over these last couple of seasons has been, it's been like a grassroots player-led movement that says, we're tired of this. We're not, it's not going to happen again. the defining trait of these last two Michigan teams has been that kind of mentality, and it's applied to the Michigan State rivalry. It's applied to winning those games on the road. It's applied to Ohio State. That next bite of the apple, the biggest bite of the apple yet, has to be finding a way to get to that next gear and keep that momentum in the 3 to 4 weeks before or between the Big Ten championship and the college football playoff. And also, knowing that if you lose a game somewhere, your season is not over. That's the biggest thing, is that oftentimes in these successful Michigan seasons, when they've lost that first game, there's usually been a loss or two that comes after it. And a big turning point for this program was in 2021 when they found a way to kind of put that Michigan State game behind them and realize that, there's a lot to play for. Even, you watch a team like Ohio State still got in the playoff last year. So keeping your goals focused on a week-to-week basis, but also knowing that there is no college football playoff mountain to get over if you don't take care of your business one game at a time. It's going to be fascinating to me how those guys keep that going, especially given that those pieces are just so similar from the last 2 years.
Well, that whole thing, I speak a lot about the climb, right? And Michigan's at a point in the climb, like I liken it a lot to the joy of being a Detroit Pistons fan in the early 2000s, right? You go from pre-Rick Carlisle to suddenly a couple of years of, 1 year of, okay, they're starting to build something. And the next year, wow, they're in the Eastern Conference Finals. And then you bring in Larry Brown and then you win the championship. And then after that, everything becomes rote, and anything less than a championship is a failure. That's kind of where Michigan is, right? And it's like the feeling, and not to just continue to grab other Detroit sports from their heydays and such. And I don't even want to say fully heydays, but it's like that almost, I don't want to say depressing feeling, but kind of depressing, like after 2006 or 2012, when the Tigers made it to the World Series and didn't win. There's something depressing that next year, less exciting when you hear pitchers and catchers report, right? Because you have this long slog before you get to the part that you actually want to see. You want to be able to sim to the end and know, can they take care of business? No longer does it become the journey. That isn't as fun. Now, the last 2 years, the journey was fun, right? Because even last year, it was kind of new because you had J.J. McCarthy as the new starting quarterback. Now there's expectations thrust upon him, thrust upon the defense. Jesse Minter, second year, third year of the defense. Blake Corum, all of these guys, we know what to expect of them. So when fall camp arrives in August, it's not going to have that same type of wonder, right? You're not actually selling hope. To use the old Mark D'Antonio line that he liked to use against Michigan. Michigan's not selling hope anymore, right? They are not doing that. They are out there saying, this is what we expect. Jim Harbaugh is embracing the national championship or bust of it all. And so when you talk about storylines, it really is just kind of what are these guys doing on the team to get to that next step, to that next stage? You hear J.J. McCarthy, it's like a video game, stuff like that. But also, how is the coaching staff self-evaluating? Because I don't fault them for the last year where it was whoops, my computer just completely blacked out. Apparently, it doesn't recognize StreamYard. It isn't because keeping in mind 2021, Michigan wasn't really supposed to be there. Georgia certainly was. Georgia, what should have been the number one seed, it should have been Michigan, Alabama. I don't know how different that game goes. I would imagine Michigan probably would have been able to give Alabama a little bit better of a showing, but that was kind of all gravy, right? No one was really going to beat Georgia, at least not again. Georgia could afford to lose one game. They lost the one game, and then they did what they did for the rest of the season when they saw Alabama for a second time. Last year's a little bit different, right? Because last year was a situation where they had no business losing to TCU. It was really Michigan giveth and Michigan taketh away, because I thought that they had elements of the game actually being pretty good. I know people don't want to hear that, but like J.J. McCarthy, on top of having his worst game, also had his best game. It's kind of a weird duality that he had. So how does he approach the season, knowing like, okay, I can throw for 343 yards. Yes, it's against a Big 12 defense, but I know I can do it. But I need to limit those mistakes. And how much does the coaching staff self-evaluate and say, hey, when we are on the 1 or 2 yard line and we have this offensive line and these all-star running backs, instead of running this really weird play with Colston Loveland with the intention of him passing to JJ McCarthy, maybe we just pound it in between the tackles because we have that capability of doing that. How do they take a look at themselves and say, where did we make a lot of big mistakes? Because that game was a debacle on pretty much every front. So in order to advance to get to that next spot, they need to be able to have the type of game plans that they've had against Ohio State. And the players need to be able to execute like they did in the last 2 games, versions of the game. So that, I think, is all the more interesting stuff. And not that we're ever going to really get answers from the coaching staff, maybe a little bit from the players about how they're approaching it. But I think that's the most important thing this offseason, is that self-reflection and trying to figure out how do they take that next step.
Yeah, there are 2 things there. I think the biggest, when you talk about with that self-reflection, where it starts, I think a lot of it has to do with, and I'm not going to blame the Joe Moore Award for this. Like, they earned that, but you lost those 2 games, the Georgia game, the TCU game, because your offensive line had maybe its 2 worst days at the office that they've had in the last 2 years. And I think that's part of it. Michigan has been so successful when they've been able to impose their will and control the line of scrimmage. And when you can do that, you get to kind of dictate the tempo of how games go and how games are played. And they haven't been as assertive as they need to be there. And the Georgia game, maybe that was just the fate of it all, because that was a historically good Georgia defensive line. But last year there was all that talk about smashing the 3-3-5, and those guys by and large looked pretty confused by it.
We laughed in their in TCU's face when they acted like they were going to be able to do what they wanted to against the Michigan offensive line. I mean, the hubris that some of us had in talking, and I'm certainly me. I don't know about you.
I'll hand to God, like, that's same deal. And I think a lot of the 3-3-5 stuff, just to go on a tangent, was that we watched it played very poorly for whatever it was, those 2 or 3 years of the Rich Rodriguez era. But so, yeah, I mean, knowing that you have to bring your best when it's all on the line, I think that's, and they know that they just didn't play well enough. Like, there's no, people will say, was it a they lose momentum, or was there a reason for it? Was someone injured? Did they overlook TCU? No, they just didn't play well. Like, sometimes it's just as simple as that. And the other point I wanted to make about all this talk about the climb is to bring a third Detroit sports team into the mix tonight. We've almost filled the bingo card here. Before the Red Wings won that cup in '97, there were several years in a row in the playoffs, because that playoff streak started, I think, in either 91 or 92, where you're getting bounced early, and you had maybe the best team in the league a few times in that span. And, it didn't always work out. It's hard to win. It's hard to be the last team standing. I think because the Georgias and the Alabamas of the world have made it look so easy. People take that for granted sometimes, but it's also, think about how much sweeter some of the success has been, namely the games against Ohio State, those weekends that Michigan fans have spent in Indianapolis over the last 2 years. Think how much sweeter that was because of all the strife that the team went through. First and foremost, it's mostly about those guys that earned that, but the fan base had been put through the ringer too. You heard all the joke. I remember I've always heard jokes, or that first Big Ten media days I went to, it was, oh, look, the Michigan guy finally got to go to Indianapolis, and you hear, all that stuff is gone now. So yeah, it'll be, to me, I think that's by far what it is how do you keep that laser focus? And that's, to me, by far what we're looking at